In the 1950s, racism and segregation was the social norm, coined by the term separate but equal from the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case. African Americans and other minorities were segregated by schools, buses, and even water fountains. This brought upon many activists and organizations fighting for equality. Some of the most prominent organizations were SNCC and the SCLC, and activists such as Rosa Parks, John Lewis, and Martin Luther King Jr. Their efforts did not go unharmed. They faced racial violence by police and public brutality.
SNCC, or the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was established in the 1960s by black and white college students. SNCC played a predominant role in the civil rights movement. John Lewis, the organization's leader, was a dedicated civil rights activist who joined to the philosophy of SNCC's peaceful demonstrations. A quote by John Lewis pertaining to the civil rights movement: "Be patient and wait. We must say that patience is a dirty and nasty word. We cannot be patient. We do not want to be free gradually. We want our freedom and we want it now. We cannot depend on any political party, for both the Democrats and the Republicans have betrayed the basic principles of the Declaration of Independence." John Lewis. Another organization during the time was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It played a major role in the fight for civil rights. The SCLC was established by no other than MLK himself in 1957. Their philosophy was for full equality for African Americans in all aspects of life in America. They promote nonviolent campaigns, and their most successful example was the Montgomery bus boycott that ended segregation on public buses.
Martin Luther King Jr. was a prominent figure in the fight for civil rights. He was just an ordinary preacher from Atlanta, but his speeches inspired and influenced Americans to fight against racial injustice and segregation. His fight for justice was brought to national attention by his use of peaceful demonstrations. Dr. King was known to use only nonviolent tactics such as marches, sit-ins, and boycotting, inspired by Gandhi. At age 35, he was the youngest to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, on April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. After his untimely death, the movement he helped create continues on fighting for equality.
Good Lord, good Lord.
One of the most symbolic fights for civil rights was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. On August 28, 1963, it was organized by the Big Six, which include many leaders like James Farmer, MLK, John Lewis, A. Philip Randolph, leader of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, Roy Wilkins, and Whitney Young Jr. 200,000 people from all over the country gathered to the Washington Monument to occupy and end segregation in the United States. At the campaign, protesters could hear artists like Josephine Baker, Joan Baez, Mahalia Jackson, and Bob Dylan. Protesters chose peace instead of violence, which made the march such an iconic political demonstration.
Like the stillness in the wind before the hurricane begins, the hour that the ship comes in.
The March on Washington came at just the right time. Tensions grew in the South, and America was in need for a demonstration showing African American ideology for equality and the justice needed in America. As a result, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Civil Rights Act of 1965. They were turning points in the struggle for civil rights. It outlawed segregation in public facilities and prohibited discriminatory practices in employment and voting.
At the march, MLK delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. In his speech, he discussed the unfairness that many black people endure. He stated, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Martin Luther King wanted to get rid of the social disparities and for America to be one unified country. He was the last one to speak at the march, and his speech was a total of 16 minutes. His speech on that day will remain as one of the most important speeches in American history.
A. Philip Randolph called the march not the climax of our struggle, but a new beginning, not only for the Negro, but for all Americans who thirst for freedom and a better life. When we leave, it will be to carry on the civil rights revolution from home with us into every nook and cranny of the land. and we shall return again and again to Washington in ever-growing numbers until total freedom is ours.
The Civil Rights Movement was a historic time in our nation's history. Without the work of thousands of activists, Black and other minorities would have never reached the equality we have today.
Free at last, thank God Almighty, we are